Welcome back, everyone. We're going to do something called Timeline of Canadian History. When did Canada start? When does it end? We're about to find out. And it's not going to end, I guess. Canada has been around for a long time. Pre-Leif Erikson. Then, of course, under the British Empire. The French Empire. Been a lot of hands. Of course, useful charts, as always, is going to provide a thorough documentation of such. So sit back, relax, hit that like button. It really does help our channel out a lot. And let's jump right in.
Today I want to give you a quick overview of Canadian history, and in particular I'm going to show you how the map of Canada has changed over the last few centuries. I'll be using my Timeline of Canadian History chart, which is available as a poster from my website usefulcharts.com. I'm from Canada, and although
But I think this is one of their older videos too, so just to let you guys know that as well.
talk a lot about history on this channel, this is actually my first video about my home country, so I'm looking forward to sharing it with you. In 2017, Canada celebrated its 150-year anniversary. A lot of Canadians
Of independence, yeah.
didn't like this though because it was considered disrespectful to the Indigenous peoples of Canada, who have been living on the land for much longer, at
But they didn't call it Canada, so that's not fair to them either.
least 15,000 years. So before we look at more recent history covered on the timeline, let's look at a map made by my friend Aaron Carapella from tribalnationsmaps.com.
Let's pause and just look at this. Wow, of course it goes all the way to the Yukon at the top left, and then what we know as like the most popular, because Canada is mostly populated like in the lower parts of Alberta, British Columbia, Ottawa, Winnipeg. Winnipeg's a city. What am I talking about? Saskatchewan, Ottawa, Quebec, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, etc., etc. I have been to Alberta. I've been to Alberta myself. I also have plans to go probably next year to Quebec. So this video is also very personal to me because I'm gonna see kind of like what's going on in Quebec if he talks about Quebec. But anyway, we got a lot of tradition right here. So many names. And of course the Inuit, I think that's what you call the Inuit, as far are the northern parts. Like, I cannot believe there are individuals and tribes that were super resilient to live in such harsh, icy conditions up there. But they did. They didn't migrate. They just lived up there. That's crazy to me.
Which shows what the land we now call Canada looked like before European colonization. And I'll put a link to Aaron's website in the video description in case you want to buy this map. First of all, note that in Canada, we use the term First Nations to refer to the Indigenous people that were living here before the Europeans arrived, as well as to refer to their descendants today. However, there are two exceptions to this. The term Inuit refers to certain Indigenous peoples living in the far north. And there's another term, Métis, which will come up a bit later, that refers to people of a mixed Indigenous European ancestry. Now, this map is pretty neat because it not only shows the locations of various First Nation groups before the arrival of European settlers, but it also uses the original name for each group in their own tongue. So as you can see, by the time the settlers arrived, Canada was already very well populated.
Very much.
And it's important to remember that it's First Nations, plural. There was not ever a single united group of people with
What about a confederacy?
a single culture living in Canada before European arrival. There were many nations, each with its own unique heritage and culture. And like I pointed out in my video on US history, it's also important for non-Indigenous Canadians to recognize the negative impact that European colonization has had on Canada's First Peoples. This negative impact continues to affect the lives of First Nations people today, and that's why we non-Indigenous Canadians need to do what we can to respect their traditions, to help protect their rights, and to help reduce the racism and discrimination that unfortunately still exists towards First Nations people today.
Of course.
So I'd like you to keep that perspective in mind as we go back to the timeline and start to go through more recent history. Let me first explain the overall layout of this chart. On the far right, we have 13 maps which show how the territory changed using 40-year intervals. In the middle, we actually have many timelines, not just one. This is important because Canada is a very large country, and what was happening on one side was often very different from what was happening on the other side.
True.
For example, you can see that Indigenous peoples were still the only population in the West long after the fall of New France in the East. On the left-hand side of the chart, we have the French and British monarchs, and then eventually the prime ministers. In Canada, the monarch is the official head of state, and the prime minister is the head of government. Now in this video, I'm mostly going to show you the maps so that we can see how the territory that we now call Canada evolved over time. The first map shows the various theories about how and when humans first arrived in North America. For most of the 20th century,
Solutrean. I've never heard about that. I've definitely heard of Clovis culture, which is Clovis is actually comes from New Mexico. So that's more like Southwest United States. Coastal migration, those icy coast. Bering Strait's been the big one that's always kept. But Solutrean, that's different. I haven't heard that one yet.
The leading theory was the Clovis first theory. Throughout the continent, there are spearheads called Clovis points, which indicate that a group of people that we call the Clovis settled North America about 13,500 years ago after having crossed over from Asia when a land bridge existed.
Yep.
But nowadays, it's thought that a different group of people may have arrived via that land bridge a little bit earlier before the Clovis. There's also growing evidence that other people arrived even earlier using boats to travel along the coast. A final theory posits that humans may have come directly from Europe, but this particular theory is the weakest and very few scholars accept it
Maybe that's why I haven't heard it.
today. So if we're looking for the earliest inhabitants of what we now call Canada, it's probably those who arrived along the Pacific by boat about 20,000 years ago. The next map indicates some of the earliest landings by European explorers. The first Europeans to arrive were the Vikings. They arrived long before Christopher Columbus, in about the year 1000, and they had at least 2 settlements on the island of Newfoundland. But these Viking settlements were long gone by the time other Europeans started to arrive.
Oh yeah.
During the European Age of Discovery, the first explorer to arrive was John Cabot. He sailed for England but was actually Italian. He landed in Newfoundland, just 5 years after Christopher Columbus landed much farther south. The first European to sail down the St. Lawrence River to the interior was Jacques Cartier. He famously claimed the land for France, but the earliest attempt at a settlement was actually by the Portuguese in Nova Scotia, but that settlement failed. So if we look at the map in the year 1590, almost 100 years after Christopher Columbus and John Cabot, there are absolutely no Europeans living in Canada.
Why?
However, there was quite a bit of fishing going on in this area. In fact, fishermen from the Basque region of Spain were known to have several seasonal fishing outposts in Newfoundland and also along the St. Lawrence River. But by 1630, things had changed. The English had settlements near Boston, but also in Newfoundland. The French established the city of Quebec and soon thereafter Montreal. They called this area New France. But they also established a settlement called Port Royal in what is now Nova Scotia. This area eventually became known as Acadia. So by 1670, you had the French in what is now Canada and the English mostly in what is now the United States. But European settlements were very much limited to the East Coast and the St. Lawrence River. The Iroquois, a confederacy of several Native American nations, were also a major power at this time, having greatly expanded their territory, much of which is off the map down here. If we zoom ahead to 1710, you'll notice several changes. England and Scotland have now united as the British, and they are starting to trade in these northern areas via
Rupert's Land.
This body of water, which is called Hudson's Bay, named after the same
guy with the other Hudson
explorer that the Hudson River in New York is named after.
Yeah.
The British called the area Rupert's Land, but it was mostly run by a company known as the Hudson's Bay Company, which interestingly still exists today, although today it mostly runs big box stores. You'll also notice that the French have greatly expanded their territory and in fact are starting to build settlements along the Mississippi River, which is off the map to the south. They called that area Louisiana after the great King Louis XIV. And this period was the golden age of New France. But it was also around this time that the British and French started to come into conflict more and more. They were fighting various wars against each other in Europe, and these wars often spilled over to their colonies as well.
Of course.
The first area that the British took over was Acadia. First the mainland, and then Cape Breton Island as well. Around this time, an event known as the expulsion of the Acadians occurred, and many Acadians ended up moving to Louisiana, where they became known as Cajuns.
Oh.
By 1763, however, the British had defeated all of New France. And about a decade after that happened, Britain's American colonies down here rebelled and declared independence. So in 1790, the map looks extremely different.
Oh yeah.
In 1750, you basically have the French up here and the British down here. But in 1790, you have the British up here and the Americans down here. So at this point, the United States of America now
And then notice Spain has Louisiana.
exists, but Canada does not. The area shown in red is simply known as British North America. At this point, you get a lot of people from America who were known as loyalists because they were loyalists to Britain, moving up from America into former French territory.
Oh.
They established the city of York, which eventually becomes Toronto, Canada's largest and most well-known city. Notice, though, that the West is still basically entirely First Nations, and even this land in the middle, although claimed by Britain, is actually just a trading area and has not yet been settled by Europeans.
Same thing for the U.S., like the Northwest Territory.
Although by 1790 more and more trade is taking place and European explorers are starting to arrive via the Pacific Ocean as well. Let's zoom ahead to 1830. The area previously known as Quebec has now been divided into Upper Canada and Lower Canada.
Upper Canada. How's Upper Canada? Is this like the Nile, where there's a river that runs? I don't know.
Upper because it's upriver, even though it's actually below Lower Canada. At this point, there's a large migration of people from Britain into Upper Canada, and therefore you get this area being primarily English-speaking, whereas the older settlements in Lower Canada are still primarily French-speaking. This division still exists to this day. Upper Canada became Ontario, and Lower Canada became Quebec.
Yep.
The colonies in what used to be Acadia have also been divided into several different provinces, and Newfoundland has come to
Oh yeah, and Labrador's over there too. One of them.
include Labrador as well.
Yeah.
Out west, there's a new territory here known as the Northwestern
Oh, and notice Russia.
Territory, and there's also the Columbia District, which is claimed jointly by both Britain and America. Finally, the Europeans are starting to settle on the prairies in an area known as Assiniboia, or the Red River Colony. This is where the Aboriginal group known as the Métis came to exist. The Métis trace their ancestry to First Nations people who intermarried with Europeans, both French and English, during this time and even earlier. Okay, so now we're at the point when the country called Canada was born. In the year 1867, 4 provinces, Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, joined together to form the Dominion of Canada. In 1870, they were joined by a 5th province, Manitoba, which was originally much smaller than it is today. But this was actually not a peaceful process. There was a Métis leader from the area named Louis Riel, who led 2 rebellions against the Canadian government. He lost both times and was eventually executed for treason. He's since become a sort of folk hero, especially among French speakers, and to this day is one of the most famous figures in Canadian history.
Oh.
In 1870, this large area here also became part of Canada, but was simply called the Northwest Territories. It was not a province because it was mostly unsettled by Europeans at that point. So the bright red sections are Canada, and the dark red sections are not. At this point, British Columbia, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland were colonies of Great Britain, separate from Canada. But by 1910, BC and PEI had joined, and the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan had formed out of the Northwest Territories. Only Newfoundland remained separate. There's also a new territory here known as the Yukon. It was the time period between these 2 maps that the darkest chapter in Canadian history began, the residential school system. The residential school system was a network of boarding schools for First Nations children that was funded by the Canadian government and usually run by churches. The purpose was to exterminate First Nations culture and to instead
assimilation
First Nations children into European culture. Children were forced out of their homes, away from their parents, and placed into these schools, where all sorts of abuses occurred. It wasn't until 1996 that the last residential school closed, and it's only been within the last 10 years or so that Canadians have started to come to terms with what happened. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established in 2008, and it published its findings in 2015. So this is still a very recent issue for Canadians, and there are both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians who are working on trying to figure out how best to repair some of the damage caused by the residential school system. But we didn't quite finish looking at the map, so let's return to those. By 1950, Newfoundland had joined Canada as its 10th and final province, and the only changes to the map that have happened since then are that Newfoundland was renamed as Newfoundland and Labrador, and the territory of Nunavut was formed out of the eastern half of...
And there's still a Northwest Territory. That's so crazy.
...the Northwest Territories.
So is the Northwest Territory a province, or is it still a territory?
So today, Canada consists of 10 provinces and 3 territories.
Oh, so those aren't even provinces. Whoa, I didn't know that.
It has 2 official languages, English and French. But Canada's multicultural diversity goes beyond just English and French. As of 2018, about 20% of Canadians are of Asian descent, and another 5% are of Middle Eastern, African, and Latin American descent. And of course, there are still many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people living in Canada. Together, they comprise about 5% of the population. So that's a very quick overview of Canada and its history. If you're interested...
Wow. I think I learned a little bit. I didn't know there was 10 provinces and 3 territories, and Canada's got an interesting, very interesting history, spanning from the First Nations to the colonization to the divvy up between the French and the British, and then eventually the British, and then just Canada, and then Canada is a part of the Commonwealth of the British Empire or the United Kingdom at this point. But so cool, so cool. If you guys have any Canadian videos or history, please send them my way. I'd love to kind of dive deeper. You know, it's the closest country to me versus Mexico. I'd love to continuously learn about the neighboring countries of the United States. Thank you so much for joining me today on this reaction. You have a great one. Peace out and goodbye.